The deafening crack of a Winchester rifle shattered the dawn silence as Josephine Thorne stood on her porch, her aim steady against the coyote threatening her last remaining hen. She didn't flinch when the animal dropped, just lowered her weapon with practiced hands that had grown too familiar with death. Her farmhouse, once filled with laughter, stood silent on the outskirts of Redemption Springs, a forgotten town in the Arizona Territory of 1885, where the endless horizon promised nothing but more emptiness. The wind carried dust across her barren fields as Josephine wiped sweat from her brow. 3 years of drought had withered her crops just as surely as grief had hollowed her heart. At 32, she had already buried more loved ones than most people twice her age, her parents to fever, her brother to the war, her husband Thomas and their 2 young children to the smallpox outbreak that had swept through the territory 18 months ago. She dragged the coyote's body away from the chicken coop, her movements mechanical. The sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day as Josephine returned to her porch and sank into the rocking chair Thomas had crafted for her on their 5th wedding anniversary. His skilled hands had carved their initials into the armrest, JT and TT intertwined like the love they once shared. Her gaze drifted to the cemetery on the hill where 3 wooden crosses stood in a row. Too many graves for one lifetime. The memories threatened to overwhelm her again, but she'd long since taught herself to push them down to focus on the day's tasks. Survival didn't leave room for dwelling on ghosts. The distant sound of hoofbeats pulled her from her thoughts. Visitors were rare in this forgotten corner of the territory. Josephine's hand instinctively moved to the rifle beside her chair as a dust cloud approached from the east, finally revealing a lone rider atop a magnificent buckskin horse. The stranger slowed his mount as he approached. Even from a distance, she could tell he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to hard travel. His clothes were trail-worn but well-kept, his hat pulled low against the sun. "Madam," he called out, keeping a respectful distance, "might I trouble you for some water?" "For my horse and myself," Josephine studied him carefully. His face was half hidden by several days' worth of beard, but his eyes were clear and direct. A gun belt rested at his hip, but that wasn't unusual for these parts. "Pumps around back," she replied, her voice rough from disuse. "Help yourself, then be on your way." He tipped his hat. "Much obliged." As he led his horse toward the water pump, Josephine noticed he favored his left leg slightly. While the stranger watered his horse, she remained vigilant on the porch, rifle within reach. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. After a few minutes, he returned to the front of the house, leading his refreshed mount. "Thank you kindly for the water," he said. "Name's Clayton Irwin." He glanced around the property, noting the abandoned plow, the overgrown fields. "Looks like you could use a hand around here." Josephine's grip tightened on her rifle. "I manage just fine." "With all due respect, madam, your south fence is down, and from the looks of your fields, you haven't put in a crop this season. What business is it of yours?" She challenged, standing to her full height. Clayton raised his hands in a placating gesture. "None at all, just offering help where it might be needed." "Death took everyone who ever helped me," Josephine said flatly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I'm better off alone." A shadow passed over Clayton's face, something like understanding. "It missed me," he said quietly, "and I'm here for you if you'll have the help." Their eyes met across the dusty yard, and something in his steady gaze made Josephine hesitate. It had been so long since anyone had offered her anything but pity. "One night," she finally said. "You can sleep in the barn. At first light, you move on." Clayton nodded. "Fair enough." As the sun began its descent, Josephine watched from the kitchen window as Clayton repaired the chicken coop, his movements efficient and practiced. He worked without complaint, pausing only to wipe sweat from his brow or take sips from his canteen. Despite her resolve to keep her distance, curiosity tugged at her. Who was this man, and why had he really stopped? Drifters were common enough, but they rarely offered help without expecting something in return. When dusk settled, she reluctantly called him in for supper, a simple meal of beans and cornbread. They ate in silence at the worn kitchen table, the lamplight casting long shadows across the room. "You have skills with carpentry," Josephine observed, breaking the silence. Clayton nodded. "Worked as a builder before the war. After, I found it harder to stay in one place." "The war changed many things," she agreed, thinking of her brother who never returned from Gettysburg. "What brought you out here?" he asked. Josephine stiffened. "My husband, Thomas. He had dreams of building something of our own, away from the crowded East." "And he succeeded," Clayton said, looking around the solidly built house. "This is good craftsmanship." "Yes, he did." She stood abruptly, gathering their empty plates. "There's clean straw in the barn. Dawn comes early." Clayton recognized the dismissal and rose. "Thank you for the meal, Mrs. Thorne." "Josephine," she corrected, surprising herself. "Just Josephine," he nodded. "Good night, Josephine." After he left, she moved through her nightly routine, checking doors, blowing out lamps, a brief glance at the faded family portrait on the mantel. But as she lay in her bed, sleep eluded her. For the first time in months, she had shared her table with another person. The simple presence of another human voice in the house had stirred something she thought long-buried connection. Morning arrived with the familiar crowing of her rooster. Josephine rose, dressed quickly, and went downstairs expecting to find Clayton preparing to leave. Instead, she found him already at work, repairing the broken porch step that she'd been meaning to fix for months. "You're still here," she stated, crossing her arms. Clayton looked up, wiping sawdust from his hands. "Noticed this was loose. Thought I'd fix it before I left." She should insist he go, remind him of their agreement, yet the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself saying, "There's coffee on the stove if you want it." He smiled then, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "I'd appreciate that." Over coffee, Clayton spoke of his travels since the war's end. He'd ridden with cattle drives in Texas, mined for silver in Colorado, and most recently worked as a ranch hand in New Mexico territory. "What brings you through these parts?" Josephine asked. "Heard they're hiring for the railroad construction near Fort Thomas," he replied. "Thought I'd try my luck there." "That's nearly 40 miles east," she noted. Clayton shrugged. "I'm not in any particular hurry." Their eyes met across the table, a silent question hanging between them. Josephine broke the connection first, rising to clear their cups. "My south fence needs mending before predators get to my chickens," she said, her back to him. "I can pay you a fair wage for a day's work." "No need for payment," Clayton responded. "A meal and a place to sleep is more than fair." Josephine turned to face him. "I don't accept charity." "It's not charity to help a neighbor," he countered. "We're not neighbors. You're passing through." Clayton held her gaze steadily. "Everyone's a neighbor to someone who needs help, Josephine." She wanted to argue further but couldn't deny she needed the assistance. With a curt nod, she accepted his offer. The day passed in productive labor. Clayton repaired the fence with skilled hands while Josephine tended to her garden and preserved vegetables for the coming winter. They worked in companionable silence, occasionally exchanging practical observations about the tasks at hand. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in vivid oranges and purples, Josephine found herself watching Clayton as he finished securing the last fence post. There was something reassuring about his presence, a solid dependability she hadn't realized she'd been missing. That evening, over a supper of rabbit stew, their conversation flowed more easily. Clayton spoke of his childhood in Pennsylvania, of his father's carpentry shop where he first learned his trade, and of his mother's love of music. "What about you?" he asked. "Have you always lived in Arizona territory?" Josephine shook her head. "We came from Missouri 8 years ago. Thomas heard there was good land to be had here." Her voice softened as memories surfaced. "He was right. The first few years were good to us." "You had children?" Clayton asked gently, noting the small wooden toys displayed on a shelf. Josephine's throat tightened. "A boy and a girl." James was 7, Sarah was 5. The familiar ache bloomed in her chest. The fever took them all within a week of each other. Thomas first, then Sarah, then James. "I buried them on the hill." Clayton's eyes held no pity, only a deep understanding that surprised her. "I lost my wife and daughter in '76, he said quietly. "Cholera." The simple acknowledgement of shared grief hung between them, neither offering empty platitudes nor demanding further explanation from the other. In that moment, Josephine felt seen in a way she hadn't since before the tragedy. "Stay another day," she found herself saying. "The barn roof needs patching before the rains come." Clayton nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. One day stretched into 3, then a week. Clayton proved himself invaluable around the farm, repairing what had fallen into disrepair during Josephine's solitary struggle to maintain the property. Together they cleaned the irrigation ditches, prepared fields for winter wheat, and reinforced the barn against the coming seasonal storms. Josephine found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the careful precision of his hands as he worked, the thoughtful expression that crossed his face when he pondered a problem, the occasional smile that transformed his weathered features. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls she had built around her heart began to crack. On the 8th day, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Clayton spoke of his plans to continue eastward. The railroad work should still be there, good wages to be had. Josephine's heart sank unexpectedly at the thought of his departure. The farm, which had seemed so empty before his arrival, would feel even emptier once he left. "You've been a great help," she said, striving to keep her voice neutral. "I'm grateful." Clayton studied her profile in the fading light. "You know, this land could be productive again, with the right help, right planning." "Are you offering to stay on as my farmhand, Mr. Irwin?" she asked, attempting lightness but hearing the vulnerability in her own question. "I'm suggesting that maybe we both need something more than wandering or isolation," he replied carefully. "Maybe we found it by accident." Josephine's pulse quickened. She hadn't allowed herself to consider such possibilities. "I hardly know you, true enough," Clayton conceded. "But sometimes life doesn't give us the luxury of time for decisions." Before she could respond, the distant sound of multiple horses approaching pulled their attention to the road. Dust clouds rose in the twilight as 3 riders approached at a brisk pace. Clayton stood, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. "Expecting visitors," Josephine shook her head, rising to stand beside him. "No." The riders drew closer, and Josephine recognized the lead man with a jolt of dread. Silas Blackwell, the cattle baron whose ranch bordered her property to the west. He had tried to buy her land repeatedly after Thomas died, his offers growing less generous and his manner more threatening with each refusal. Blackwell reined his horse to a stop, flanked by 2 rough-looking men Josephine didn't recognize. His cold eyes assessed Clayton before turning to her. "Mrs. Thorne," he greeted with false warmth. "I see you've acquired help, Mr. Blackwell," she replied stiffly. "What brings you to my property?" "Just being neighborly," Blackwell said, though his smile never reached his eyes. "Heard there was a stranger in the area. Thought I'd make sure everything was proper." Clayton stepped forward slightly. "Clayton Irwin," he introduced himself, his voice level but with an edge of steel beneath the courtesy. "Just passing through, lending a hand where it's needed." Blackwell's gaze shifted between them, calculating. "Mighty generous of you, Mr. Irwin, though Mrs. Thorne should know better than to trust drifters. These parts can be dangerous for a woman alone." "I manage just fine," Josephine said firmly. "For now, perhaps." Blackwell adjusted his hat. "But winter's coming and you've barely got enough to feed yourself, let alone plant for spring. My offer still stands fair price for the land, enough for you to start fresh somewhere more, suitable for a widow." Clayton remained silent, but Josephine felt his tension beside her. "This land isn't for sale," she stated. "Not now, not ever." Blackwell's expression hardened. "You always were stubborn, Josephine. Your husband had more sense." "You do well to leave now," Clayton interjected, his hand still resting near his pistol. The rancher's eyes narrowed. "And who might you be to her? Not family, certainly." "A friend," Clayton replied simply. "One who believes Mrs. Thorne has the right to her own property without harassment." A tense silence followed as Blackwell assessed the situation. Finally, he gathered his reins. "Friends come and go, Mrs. Thorne. Neighbors are permanent, something to consider." He tipped his hat mockingly. "Good evening to you both." The three men turned their horses and rode away, but Josephine had no doubt they would return. Once they were out of sight, she released a shaky breath. Blackwell's been trying to expand his ranch for years. He wants my water rights more than anything. Has he threatened you before? Clayton asked, his expression grim. Not directly, but there have been incidents, fence cutting, missing livestock. She rubbed her arms against a sudden chill. Nothing I could prove was his doing. Clayton's jaw tightened. Men like that don't give up easily. No, she agreed softly. They don't. They returned to the house in silence, the easy companionship of earlier replaced by a new tension. As they prepared for the night, Josephine found herself reluctant to be alone, the encounter with Blackwell having unsettled her more than she cared to admit. You should take the spare room tonight, she offered as Clayton prepared to head to the barn. It's safer. He studied her face. You sure? She nodded. It's just a precaution. That night, knowing Clayton was just down the hall brought Josephine a sense of security she hadn't felt since Thomas died. Yet it also stirred a confusion of emotions she wasn't ready to confront. She lay awake, listening to the familiar creaks of the house, wondering what path her life was now taking. Morning brought no clarity, but it did bring a new determination. After breakfast, Josephine brought out a wooden box containing the farm's paperwork deeds, tax receipts, and the small amount of savings she had managed to hold onto. I need to be practical, she said, spreading the documents on the table. This farm needs more than just repairs. It needs capital to plant properly in spring to buy livestock. Clayton examined the papers carefully. Your land is good. With water rights and proper management, it could be profitable again. But I can't do it alone, she admitted, the words costing her pride. And I don't have money to hire help. He was silent for a moment, thoughtful. I have some savings, not much, but enough to buy seed and maybe a few head of cattle to start. Josephine stared at him, stunned by the offer. Why would you invest in a stranger's farm? You're not exactly a stranger anymore, Josephine, he said gently. And I told you I'm looking for something more permanent than drifting. You're proposing a business arrangement, she clarified, her heart beating faster. To start with, he replied, meeting her eyes. Unless you have objections to something more in time. The directness of his gaze made her look away, flustered. I haven't thought of that since Thomas. I'm not asking for promises, Clayton assured her. Just a chance to build something here together. Josephine took a deep breath. The practical part of her recognized the sense in his proposal. The farm needed a man's labor as much as her own, and she couldn't afford to hire help. But another part of her, the wounded heart that had sworn never to risk love again, trembled at the prospect. A partnership, she finally said. We'll try it until spring, see if the arrangement suits us both. Clayton nodded, respecting her caution. Agreed. They shook hands across the table, a simple gesture that nonetheless felt momentous. For the first time since the funerals, Josephine allowed herself to consider a future beyond mere survival. The following days established a new rhythm to life on the farm. They rose with the sun, sharing breakfast before tackling the day's tasks. Clayton's presence brought energy and purpose back to the property. Fields were cleared for planting, the chicken coop expanded, and plans made for rebuilding the small herd of cattle that had once grazed the northern pasture. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes companionably silent. Clayton whittled wood figures, a skill he had developed during long nights on cattle drives while Josephine mended clothes or read aloud from one of the few books she owned. As October gave way to November, the air turned crisp with approaching winter. One clear morning, Clayton suggested they ride into town for supplies. Redemption Springs, Josephine hesitated. I haven't been to town in months. All the more reason to go, he urged gently. We need tools I can't make and seed to set aside for spring. She knew he was right, but the thought of facing the townspeople's curiosity and pity made her stomach tighten. Still, she couldn't hide forever. Very well, we'll go tomorrow. The 12-mile ride to Redemption Springs the next day was filled with a nervous tension that Clayton seemed to sense. He kept the conversation light, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his travels. As they crested the final hill and the town came into view, a collection of wooden buildings straddling the main road, Josephine took a steadying breath. Clayton reached across the space between their horses and briefly squeezed her hand. "Just a few hours," he reassured her. "Then we head home." Home? The word settled warmly in her chest, despite her anxiety. Redemption springs had grown since her last visit, the promise of the coming railroad having drawn new businesses and settlers. They tied their horses at the hitching post outside the general store, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Inside, Mr. Peterson, the proprietor, did a double take when Josephine entered. "Mrs. Thorne, didn't expect to see you today." "Hello, Mr. Peterson," she greeted stiffly. "We need supplies." The storekeeper's eyes darted to Clayton, questions evident in his expression. "We is it, Clayton Irwin," Clayton introduced himself, extending his hand. "I'm working Mrs. Thorne's farm with her." Peterson shook his hand, clearly bursting with curiosity but professional enough not to pry openly. "Well, any friend of Josephine's is welcome here. What can I get for you folks today?" As they gathered their supplies, nails, tools, fabric, and preserved goods they couldn't produce themselves, Josephine felt the weight of stares from other customers. Whispers followed them through the store and she caught fragments: widow and drifter and improper. Her cheeks burned, but Clayton remained unfazed, treating her with quiet respect as they completed their shopping. When Peterson tallied their purchases, Clayton paid from his own funds, confirming to Josephine that he was indeed committed to their partnership. "We should get something to eat before heading back," Clayton suggested as they loaded their supplies onto the pack horse they'd brought for that purpose. Josephine's instinct was to decline, to retreat back to the safety of the farm, but she straightened her spine. "The cafe serves decent food," she conceded. The small eatery was half full when they entered. Conversation momentarily halted as heads turned toward them, then resumed in hushed tones. Josephine spotted familiar faces, neighbors who had brought food after the funerals, but gradually stopped visiting when her grief showed no signs of abating. They chose a table by the window, and the waitress, a young woman Josephine didn't recognize, brought them coffee and took their order for stew and biscuits. "People are staring," Josephine murmured, her hands tightening around her coffee cup. "Let them," Clayton replied simply. Nothing wrong with two people having a meal together. Before she could respond, a shadow fell across their table. Josephine looked up to see Martha Simmons, the minister's wife, standing beside them with a forced smile. "Josephine, dear." "How wonderful to see you in town again," Martha said, her voice pitched to carry to nearby tables. "It's been far too long." "Mrs. Simmons," Josephine acknowledged with a nod. Martha's gaze shifted to Clayton, assessing. "And who might this gentleman be?" Clayton stood politely, offering his hand. "Clayton Irwin, madam. Mr. Irwin is helping restore the farm," Josephine added, determined not to show discomfort under the woman's scrutiny. "How providential," Martha remarked, a hint of judgment in her tone. "And where are you staying, Mr. Irwin?" "The hotel in town is quite reasonable, I hear." The implication was clear, and Josephine felt heat rise to her face again. Before she could formulate a response that wouldn't sound defensive, Clayton spoke. "Mrs. Thorne has kindly provided accommodations at the farm," he said smoothly. "Saves me the daily ride to work the land." Martha's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. Well, perhaps you'll both join us for Sunday services. The Reverend gives such uplifting sermons on propriety and moral fortitude." "Thank you for the invitation," Josephine replied stiffly. "We'll consider it." With a last meaningful look between them, Martha moved away to join another table, immediately leaning in to share what she'd learned. "I'm sorry," Josephine said quietly when they were alone again. "Small towns have long memories and longer tongues," Clayton shrugged. "I've weathered worse than gossip." Their food arrived, temporarily distracting them from the whispers around them. They ate quickly, both eager to be on the road home. As they were preparing to leave, the cafe door opened to admit Silas Blackwell and one of the men who had accompanied him to Josephine's farm. Blackwell's eyes narrowed when he spotted them. "Well now," he drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mrs. Thorne and her farmhand." Taking in the town sights, Clayton stood, positioning himself slightly in front of Josephine. Just finishing our business, Mr. Blackwell. Business, is it? Blackwell smirked. Interesting choice of words. The cafe had gone silent, all eyes on the confrontation. Josephine rose, touching Clayton's arm lightly. We should go. Blackwell blocked their path to the door. No need to rush off. I'm curious about your arrangement with Mrs. Thorne, Irwin. Must be mighty rewarding to work for such a handsome widow. Clayton's jaw tightened, but his voice remained controlled. Step aside, Blackwell, or what? The rancher challenged. You'll draw on me in front of all these good people. That would certainly confirm what kind of man you really are. Josephine felt the tension radiating from Clayton and feared what might happen next. To her surprise, he relaxed his stance and even managed a smile. The kind of man who respects a lady enough not to brawl in her presence, Clayton replied evenly. Now, if you'll excuse us. He guided Josephine around Blackwell, who reluctantly stepped aside, clearly disappointed at being denied the confrontation he sought. This isn't finished, Blackwell called after them as they reached the door. A woman can't run a proper farm, and a drifter can't change his nature. You'll be selling to me before winter's end, mark my words. Clayton paused at the threshold, turning back to face the rancher. Mrs. Thorne isn't alone anymore, he stated firmly. Remember that. Outside in the crisp air, Josephine released a shaky breath. Thank you for not engaging with him. He was trying to provoke me, Clayton observed as they untied their horses. Wanted me to show a temper, confirm the town's suspicions about my character. He won't stop, she warned. Not until he gets what he wants. Clayton helped her mount before swinging into his own saddle. Then he's in for a long wait. They rode in thoughtful silence for several miles, each processing the day's events. The encounter with Blackwell had made clear that their partnership would face opposition beyond mere gossip. Perhaps we should have attended church, Josephine mused as they rode. Shown we have nothing to hide, Clayton glanced at her. Do we have something to hide? The directness of his question caught her off guard. No, of course not. We have a business arrangement. Is that all it is to you, Josephine? He asked quietly. She kept her eyes forward, watching the road. What else could it be? We've known each other barely a month. Time isn't always the measure of connection, he said. Sometimes you just know when something feels right. His words stirred emotions Josephine had kept carefully buried. The truth was, Clayton's presence had awakened feelings she thought died with Thomas, not just companionship, but the stirrings of something deeper. Yet acknowledging such feelings seemed a betrayal of her past and a risk to her fragile present. I can't, she finally whispered. Not yet. Clayton nodded, understanding in his eyes. I'm not asking for what you can't give, just honesty between us. Then honestly, I don't know what I feel, she admitted, except that I'm grateful you're here. He smiled then, the warmth of it reaching his eyes. That's enough for now. As they rode the rest of the way home, Josephine felt something shift within her, not a decision made, but a possibility acknowledged. For the first time since the graves were dug on the hill, she allowed herself to consider that her heart might not be permanently closed. The weeks that followed brought colder weather and the first dustings of snow to the high desert. Clayton and Josephine settled into a comfortable routine, working side by side during daylight hours and sharing quiet evenings by the fire. Though they maintained separate sleeping quarters, Clayton in the spare room that had once belonged to James, there was an undeniable deepening of their bond. Clayton proved to be a skilled hunter, ensuring their table had fresh meat even as winter tightened its grip on the land. Josephine, in turn, taught him the secrets of her garden, which plants needed protection from frost, which could withstand the cold. One evening in early December, as they sat before the hearth, Clayton presented Josephine with a small wooden carving he had been working on for days, a delicate rose, each petal lovingly detailed. It's beautiful, she said, turning it over in her hands. My mother loved roses, he explained. Had a garden full of them back in Pennsylvania. My father would carve them for her when they couldn't grow in winter. Josephine traced the wooden petals with her fingertip. Your mother was fortunate to be so loved. She was, Clayton agreed. They had 42 years together before he passed. He paused, watching the firelight dance across Josephine's features. I've been thinking about what they had, how they built a life together, through good times and hard ones. Something in his tone made Josephine look up, meeting his gaze across the space between their chairs. I know we agreed to see how things stood in spring, Clayton continued. But I want to be clear about my intentions, Josephine. I care for you more than as a business partner or friend. The wooden rose felt suddenly heavy in her palm. Clayton, you don't need to answer now, he assured her quickly. I just wanted you to know where I stand, that I'm not just passing through anymore. I'm here because I want to be with you. Josephine's heart raced. Part of her wanted to flee from the intensity of his gaze, from the possibility of both joy and pain that his words offered. But another part, growing stronger each day, yearned to take the risk. I've been alone so long, she whispered. I don't know if I remember how to be anything else. Clayton leaned forward, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. You don't have to be alone anymore, not if you don't want to be. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he reached for her hand. His palm was warm against hers, calloused from hard work but gentle in its touch. Josephine found herself meeting him halfway, their fingers intertwining in a silent acknowledgement of mutual feeling. I'm afraid, she admitted, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Of what? Of losing again, of caring and then being left alone. Clayton's grip tightened reassuringly. I can't promise forever, no one can, but I can promise that I won't willingly leave you, that I choose to be here with you for as long as you'll have me. Josephine looked down at their joined hands, then back to his face. In his steady gaze, she found no falsehood, no hidden agenda, only honest affection and hope. Before she could respond, a sound from outside caught their attention, the distant but distinct crack of a rifle. Clayton was on his feet instantly. Stay here, he ordered, moving to the window and cautiously peering out into the darkness. Josephine ignored his instruction, joining him with her own rifle already in hand. What do you see? Nothing yet, he murmured, but that shot was close. They stood in tense silence, straining to hear any further disturbance. Minutes passed before a flicker of movement caught their attention, shadows moving near the barn. At least 3 of them, Clayton assessed. Armed. Blackwell, Josephine whispered, certainty in her voice. Clayton nodded grimly. Likely, he's making his move. He turned to her, decision made. We need to get to the barn before they try to fire it. Stay low, follow me. They slipped out the back door into the cold night air, keeping to the shadows as they made their way toward the barn. The moon was 3/4 full, providing just enough light to navigate but also exposing them if they weren't careful. As they neared the structure, voices became audible, rough, male voices speaking in hushed tones. Just scare them off, one was saying. Boss don't want no killings if it can be helped. That drifter's got a reputation, another responded. Heard he was in some shootout in Colorado, might not scare so easy. Then we make it clear the woman gets hurt if he tries anything heroic. A third voice added, sending ice through Josephine's veins. Clayton's expression hardened as he heard this. He gestured for Josephine to stay back, but she shook her head firmly, pointing to herself and then to the left side of the barn. They would approach from different angles. With a reluctant nod, Clayton moved right while Josephine circled left, both keeping their rifles ready. As she rounded the corner, Josephine could see 3 men, Blackwell's ranch hands, preparing to douse the barn's wooden walls with what smelled like lamp oil. That's far enough, she called out, stepping into view with her rifle aimed. Drop it and step back. The men froze, then slowly turned to face her. One, a heavy-set man with a patchy beard, smirked when he saw her alone. Look here, boys, the widow's come to defend her property. He took a menacing step forward. Where's your protector now, Mrs. Thorne? Right here, Clayton's voice came from behind them as he emerged from the shadows, his own weapon trained on the group. Drop your weapons, all of you. The men exchanged glances, clearly reassessing their position now that they were caught in a crossfire. You're outnumbered, the leader pointed out, though with less confidence. But outgunned, Clayton countered steadily. Mrs. Thorne doesn't miss at this range. Do you really want to test that? A tense standoff ensued, seconds stretching like hours as each side waited for the other to make a move. Finally, the leader cursed under his breath and slowly lowered his gun to the ground. "This ain't over," he growled. "Mr. Blackwell gets what he wants one way or another." "Not this time," Josephine stated firmly. "Tell Blackwell if he sends anyone else to threaten my property or my family, I'll ride straight to the marshal in Fort Thomas. I've kept records of every incident, every threat." The men looked uncertain at this news, clearly not having expected such resistance. "Now go," Clayton ordered, "and don't come back." They backed away slowly, hands raised, until they reached their horses tied at the edge of the property. As they mounted and rode off into the night, Josephine lowered her rifle. Suddenly aware of how badly her hands were shaking, Clayton moved to her side immediately. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her heart still raced. "Yes, but they'll be back with more men next time." "Then we'll be ready," he assured her, his arm coming around her shoulders. The simple protective gesture broke something inside Josephine, the last barrier of self-sufficiency she had maintained since losing her family. She turned into Clayton's embrace, allowing herself to draw strength from his solid presence. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest, his arms tightened around her. "For what? For being here? For not leaving when things got difficult?" Clayton's hand gently tilted her face up to his. In the moonlight, his expression was solemn yet tender. "I meant what I said earlier, Josephine. I'm not going anywhere." Something shifted in that moment, a decision made, a risk embraced. Josephine raised herself on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his in a gentle, questioning kiss. Clayton responded with equal gentleness, one hand cradling her face as if she were made of precious glass. When they parted, his eyes searched hers, finding no regret, only certainty. "I choose to not be alone anymore," she said softly. "I choose you, Clayton." His smile illuminated the darkness between them. "Then we face whatever comes together." Hand in hand, they returned to the house, the night's danger having solidified what had been gradually building between them for weeks. As they reached the porch, Clayton paused. "We should ride to town tomorrow," he suggested. "Report what happened to the sheriff." Josephine nodded. "Yes, though I doubt Sheriff Mills will do much. He and Blackwell are close. Even so, we need to make an official complaint." Clayton's expression turned thoughtful. "And while we're there, perhaps we could speak with the Reverend." "The Reverend?" Josephine questioned. "Why?" Clayton's gaze was steady on hers. "Because I'd like to ask if he'd be willing to marry us if you'll have me." Josephine's breath caught. "Clayton, are you certain? It's so soon." "I've never been more certain of anything," he replied. "Life's too short and too precious to waste time once you know what you want, and I want you, Josephine Thorne, as my wife, my partner, the mother of the family we could build together." Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow this time, but of unexpected joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Clayton gathered her into his arms, sealing their promise with a kiss that spoke of hope, of future, of love rekindled from ashes. As they entered the house together, Josephine cast one glance back at the cemetery on the hill. She would always honor those she had lost, but now she understood that her own life wasn't meant to end with theirs. The next morning dawned bright and cold, the night's events seeming almost dreamlike in the clear winter light. Josephine woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of Clayton moving about the kitchen. For a moment, she lay still, savoring the simple pleasure of knowing she was no longer alone. They rode into Redemption Springs with purpose, heading first to the sheriff's office. As expected, Sheriff Mills listened to their account of the night's events with skepticism. "No proof it was Blackwell's doing," he pointed out, leaning back in his chair. "Could have been any drifters causing trouble. We recognized his men," Josephine insisted, "and they spoke of their boss giving orders." Mills shrugged. "Hearsay. Not enough to make accusations against a respected rancher like Mr. Blackwell." Clayton stepped forward, his voice level but firm. "We're not asking you to make arrests today, Sheriff. We're filing a formal complaint so there's a record, if anything happens to Mrs. Thorne, her property, or myself, there will be no question where to look first." The sheriff's eyes narrowed at the implicit challenge, but he reached for his ledger. "Fine, I'll note your concerns." As they left the office, Josephine squeezed Clayton's hand gratefully. "Thank you for insisting." Their next stop was the small church at the edge of town. Reverend Simmons received them in his study, surprise evident on his face at their visit. "Mrs. Thorne, Mr. Irwin, this is unexpected. We've come with a request, Reverend," Clayton explained after they were seated. "I've asked Mrs. Thorne to marry me and she's accepted. We'd like you to perform the ceremony." The minister's eyebrows shot up. "Marriage, but you've known each other such a short time." "Long enough to know our minds and hearts," Josephine replied with quiet dignity. Reverend Simmons studied them thoughtfully. "Mrs. Thorne, are you certain this is what you want? After your loss, it would be understandable if you were seeking security rather than a true marriage." Clayton tensed beside her, but Josephine placed a calming hand on his arm. "What I feel for Mr. Irwin is not born of desperation, Reverend. It's a choice made with clear eyes and a full heart. And you, Mr. Irwin, your intentions are honorable. You understand the commitment marriage entails." "I do," Clayton affirmed. "I lost my own family years ago, Reverend. I know the value of what I'm asking for, and I don't take it lightly." After a moment's consideration, the minister nodded. "Very well. When would you like to have the ceremony?" "As soon as possible," Clayton replied. "Next Sunday after services?" "That can be arranged," Reverend Simmons agreed. "Though I must advise you there may be talk. The community may need time to adjust to this development." "Let them talk," Josephine said with newfound confidence. "We know the truth of our feelings." As they left the church, word of their engagement seemed to spread through town with remarkable speed. By the time they reached the general store to purchase supplies, Mr. Peterson was already offering congratulations. "Well now, this is happy news indeed," the shopkeeper exclaimed. "Been too long since we had a wedding in Redemption Springs." Others were less enthusiastic. Martha Simmons, whom they encountered outside the millinery shop, offered tight-lipped congratulations that sounded more like condolences. "So soon after your bereavement," she clucked. "One might think a longer period of mourning appropriate." "I've mourned for 18 months, Mrs. Simmons," Josephine replied evenly. "Life continues even after great loss." As they prepared to leave town, a familiar figure blocked their path. Silas Blackwell, his expression thunderous. "Heard the news," he said without preamble. "Clever move, Irwin. Marry the widow, get the land." Clayton dismounted, keeping his voice low. "You've got it wrong, Blackwell. The land is Mrs. Thorne's, married or not. I'm not interested in taking it from her, only in protecting what's rightfully hers." "And what about last night?" Blackwell demanded. "My men say you threatened them when they were just passing by your property." "Your men were preparing to burn down my barn," Josephine interjected, her voice carrying to nearby pedestrians. "With lamp oil they brought specifically for that purpose." Blackwell's face reddened. "Lies, you have no proof of such accusations." "Perhaps not enough for the law," Clayton conceded, "but enough for anyone with sense to see the truth." "Back off, Blackwell. Find another piece of land to covet." The rancher stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "This isn't over, Irwin, not by a long shot." "Yes, it is," Clayton replied firmly. "Unless you want your business with the Territorial Bank examined too closely. I hear they take a dim view of forged loan documents." Blackwell paled visibly. "What are you talking about?" "I worked for Judge Parker in Fort Smith before the war," Clayton revealed. "Learned to recognize certain patterns of fraud. Would be a shame if someone with that knowledge happened to mention concerns to the bank examiner due here next month." It was a bluff. Clayton had never worked for Judge Parker, but the calculated risk paid off. Uncertainty flickered in Blackwell's eyes. "You're bluffing," he accused, but with less conviction. Clayton merely smiled. "Care to wager your ranch on that?" After a tense moment, Blackwell stepped back. "Keep your worthless patch of dirt," he spat. "It's not worth the trouble." As the rancher stormed away, Josephine turned to Clayton in amazement. "Judge Parker, you never mentioned that." Clayton's eyes twinkled with mischief as he mounted his horse again. "Because it never happened." "But Blackwell doesn't know that." Josephine laughed, a free, genuine sound that surprised even her. "Clayton Irwin, you are full of surprises." "I hope to keep surprising you for many years to come," he replied warmly. They rode home with lighter hearts, the threats against them neutralized, at least temporarily. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of promise. The days leading up to their wedding passed in a flurry of preparation. News spread throughout the surrounding area, bringing unexpected visitors to the farm neighbors Josephine hadn't seen in months, offering congratulations and, more practically, food and gifts for the celebration. Among them was Alina Jenkins, whose husband ran the smithy in town. She arrived with a basket of preserves and a warm embrace for Josephine. "I've missed you, my friend," Alina said. "After Thomas and the children, well, you shut everyone out. We understood, but we worried." "I couldn't bear the sympathy," Josephine admitted as they sat at her kitchen table. "It was easier to be alone." Alina glanced toward the barn where Clayton was working. "And now, is it still easier to be alone?" Josephine smiled softly. "No, now I realize how much harder it was." "He seems a good man," Alina observed. "Steady, he is," Josephine confirmed. "He understands loss in a way few do, doesn't try to erase it or pretend it never happened." "The best kind of love doesn't replace what came before," Alina said wisely. "It honors it while building something new." On Sunday morning, Josephine stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, wearing her best dress, a deep blue wool that Thomas had always admired. Her fingers trembled slightly as she secured the silver locket containing miniature portraits of her children around her neck. A light knock at the door announced Alina, who had come to help her prepare. "You look beautiful," her friend assured her. "Are you nervous?" "A little," Josephine confessed. "I never thought I'd stand before a minister again, not like this." Alina squeezed her hand. "Thomas would want you to be happy, you know. He wasn't the kind of man to wish loneliness on those he loved." "I know," Josephine whispered. I think they all would approve. Thomas, James, Sarah, they'd want me to live, not just survive." The simple church was filled with more people than Josephine had expected, not just the curious, but those who genuinely wished them well. Clayton stood at the altar in a clean black suit, his hair neatly trimmed, his eyes finding hers the moment she entered. In that gaze, Josephine found home, not the physical structure of the farm, but the emotional sanctuary of being truly seen and valued. As she walked toward him, each step felt like moving forward in more ways than one. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, their voices clear and certain as they exchanged vows. When Reverend Simmons pronounced them husband and wife, Clayton's kiss was both tender promise and passionate seal of their commitment. The celebration afterward, held at the farm, stretched into evening. Neighbors had contributed food and music, transforming the once silent homestead into a place of joy and community. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, and couples began dancing to fiddle music under the stars. Clayton led Josephine into a simple waltz, his hand warm at her waist. "Happy Mrs. Irwin," the new name startled her momentarily, then settled like a comfortable garment. "Yes," she answered honestly. "Happier than I thought possible again." He pulled her closer. "This is just the beginning." As the last guests departed and quiet descended once more upon the farm, Josephine and Clayton stood on the porch, his arm around her shoulders as they gazed at the stars. "Thank you," she said softly. Clayton looked down at her. "For what?" "For finding me when I was lost. For showing me that life continues, even after great loss." He turned her to face him, his expression solemn in the moonlight. "Death took everyone from you once," he said, echoing her words from their first meeting. "But it missed me, and I'm here for you now, always." Josephine reached up to touch his face, mapping the contours that had become so dear to her in such a short time. "And I'm here for you. We face whatever comes together." Their kiss sealed the promise, a testament to resilience, to hope, to the unexpected gift of second chances. Spring arrived in a riot of wildflowers across the Arizona hills, bringing with it new life to the Irwin farm. The winter wheat Clayton had planted was growing strong, the expanded chicken flock produced eggs in abundance, and the small herd of cattle they had purchased with Clayton's savings grazed contentedly in the north pasture. But the most significant new life was the one Josephine carried beneath her heart, confirmation that came from Dr. Watson in early April, though she had suspected for weeks before. "A child," Clayton had whispered in wonder when she told him, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our child." The news had filled Josephine with both joy and trepidation. The memories of James and Sarah remained precious to her, their graves still tended with care on the hill. But this new life represented hope, continuation, proof that love could be reborn from ashes. One warm evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in gold and crimson, Clayton took Josephine's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "The baby will need a proper room." Josephine nodded. "We could use the spare room, make it a nursery. Or," Clayton suggested carefully, "we could build an addition, something new just for them." She understood what he was offering, not replacing what had been lost, but creating something alongside it. A new chapter rather than an erasure of the previous ones. "I'd like that," she agreed. "Something new with windows facing east to catch the morning sun." Clayton smiled, clearly relieved at her response. "I'll draw up plans tomorrow." As darkness settled over the land, they remained on the porch, speaking of the future they were building together, the farm's expansion, the child's education, the community they were once again part of. In the distance, coyotes called to one another across the vast desert, their voices neither mournful nor joyous, simply alive in the present moment. Josephine rested her head against Clayton's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid warmth of his presence. Death had indeed taken everyone she loved once. But life, persistent and renewing, had brought her Clayton, a man who understood loss because he had lived it, who valued joy because he knew its fragility, who loved her not despite her scars, but because of the strength they represented. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly, noticing her contemplative silence. Josephine smiled, her hand resting on the slight swell where their child grew. "I'm thinking that endings can become beginnings if we're brave enough to let them." Clayton's arm tightened around her. "And are you?" Brave enough, she looked up at the star-filled sky, then back to the man beside her, her partner, her husband, her future. "Yes," she answered with certainty. "With you I am." The night enveloped them in its gentle darkness, a reminder that even after the longest day, dawn always returns, bringing with it the promise of new light, new growth, new possibilities. On the hill behind the house, the three crosses stood as testament to loves never forgotten. In the valley below, the farmhouse windows glowed with warmth, bearing witness to love rekindled, to life continuing its eternal cycle of loss and renewal. For Josephine and Clayton Irwin, the journey ahead would hold its share of challenges and joys, of ordinary days and momentous occasions. But they would face them together, two people who had learned the hard lesson that time is precious and love worth the risk of pain. In the end, that was the greatest gift they had given each other, not the erasing of past sorrows, but the courage to embrace future joys. Not the forgetting of those lost, but the honoring of their memory through continued living. Not perfect happiness untouched by grief, but deep contentment born of weathering life's storms and still choosing to dance in the rain. And in the quiet moments between dusk and dawn, when the world held its breath before beginning anew, they would hold each other close and remember the truth they had discovered together. That even in a land as harsh and unforgiving as the Western Territories, love could take root and flourish, bringing color and life to places long thought barren. That autumn, when their daughter was born with eyes as bright as her father's and a spirit as determined as her mother's, they named her Hope, not as a wish for what might be, but as recognition of what already was. A testament to the fact that even after the darkest night, morning always comes again, bearing with it the promise of a new day and all the possibilities it contains.